What originally began as a regular review, going over the form and function of these Parkhurst Richmond Capto boots, soon evolved into a detailed documentary, with interviews, including with Andrew Savisco, the founder and owner of Parkhurst. All so I could show you how heritage boots like these can take you to all kinds of places, in all kinds of conditions with style. Along the way, you will also hear how they sound and see how they age in a lot of different conditions. In addition to a bunch of leather and boot comparisons, plus extensive details on boot design, fit, comfort, sizing, and durability. And if all that still isn't enough, check out some conditioning experiments too. Now, because style is supposedly subjective, let's find out what people from around the world think about these boots, along with some green outfits I put together.
Your outfit today, it gives me a sense of a tree or a forest, because in a forest we have a different type of colors, green. Also, your boots, all of the material, and it's like roots of this tree.
She did indeed perfectly pick out the inspiration for this outfit. Just look at how it fits right in the forest. Next, let's hear from a fellow South African.
So we've got some really cool boots going here. They remind me of South Africa's valleys. I think I'm saying that right. It's the material. They are super, super cool, and we are sporting the Springboks shirt.
She makes a good point. They do somewhat resemble the outline of vellies from South Africa, better known to the rest of the world as chukka or desert boots. There's no doubt about that when they're beside these chukka boots. The likeness is even more striking since the dark olive waxed rough-out upper is quite similar in color and texture to the classic brown suede combination commonly found on chukkas around the world. When looking at them beside a completely different pair made from a heavily oiled red leather, we can still make out a common outline. The commonalities continue, with all three pairs being built on top of relatively low-profile lug soles with that familiar commando tread pattern originally from Vibram. And in case you were wondering, these chukkas were made in England by the English brand Jadd, which I covered in my second ever video. Because of this chukka-like outline, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about versatility in terms of formality, since the chukka silhouette provides great versatility in terms of formality, which will then be further affected by the material of the upper, as well as the type of outsole.
On a scale of 1 to 10, these are interesting because they could be casual and they could be more formal. So I would say 7, which means you can do either one with them, casual or formal.
Overall, I would agree with her assessment, not just because she's South African, but because if we are just talking about the outline, it is versatile to be casual in day-to-day wear and also be more dressed up. However, if we're talking about all the elements together, the dark olive waxed rough-out, along with the lug outsole, lower the formality with a rougher texture on top and more bulk on the bottom. If this was a variation with a flatter rubber outsole and a smooth dark brown leather upper, then these could definitely be a 7 out of 10 in terms of formality. That being said, these still look more neat and put together at a distance, because they look dark and uniform in most lighting when someone is usually 5 or more meters away from them. Even when people do get closer, they usually won't show that much variation, and dirt blends into them easier or has a harder time sticking on in the first place, if I've just worn these around the city. But that's not just my opinion. She, along with other people off camera, have confirmed this.
And then looking at the boot, they do not pick up dirt for some reason. and they don't get scuffed. So they do not look dirty or damaged at all. So I think they are some really, really steady, hardy, probably not fallies, but some really cool boots.
To better envision that more formal 7 out of 10 boot, it could look something like this Viberg Service Boot, with the extra elements of having medium to dark brown stitching and midsoles for lower contrast, plus smaller speed hooks and eyelets. Right now, I don't live a very formal lifestyle, so these are excellent for me in casual everyday wear, looking neat and put together enough while still having the ability to occasionally go through rougher conditions, making them quite similar in form and function to these Viberg Navy boots in earth chamois on a Ridgeway sole built around the famous 2030 last. Besides going all green, these can go well with blue and red, especially when the clothing has more texture with things like denim and wool. In the winter, they could also be paired with a wool coat, and it would look put together without being too formal. The third person that said yes to my street style interviews about the outfits kept accidentally turning off my camera, or his fingers got in the way of the lens. It was just my phone camera, but something would keep going wrong, and eventually we ran out of time, as I had to go and he had to go. Which is a shame because even though he didn't have much to say, he said something that was quite eye-opening when comparing the perspectives of people that basically have zero knowledge about style and heritage boots compared to people who are well versed on the topics. After a few long pauses and stuttering, he got closer to the boots and pointed to the cap-toe stitching, moving his finger from side to side, followed by making a half circle motion, outlining the curve of the 270-degree double row stitch down construction. As he said, "I like the lining." Instead of referring to another layer of softer leather that's placed inside boots, he meant lining as in the eye-catching stitching, which kind of goes back to what I was talking about in my review of the Parkhurst Niagara Boot, and how people tend to focus on the mock toe stitching. For the Richmond, this eye-catching effect is amplified even more because of the highly contrasting white thread, which I was initially a little on the fence about. It wasn't a deal breaker, and didn't significantly detract from the boots. But sometimes I did think it was kind of out of place or a bit mismatched, because they appeared too bright when they were new and clean. Eventually I got used to it, and surprisingly, even with a lot of dirt and water exposure, the stitching still stayed quite white. Targeted cleaning with a damp rag easily renewed that bright appearance, which never really disappeared even a year later, as shown by the clean boot on the right and the uncleaned boot on the left. This was the one and only time I've wiped the stitching directly, and it reveals that the thread for the double row stitch down barely shows its age, whereas you can see some fading and aging more clearly with the thread on the upper. This design choice with the higher contrasting thread does give it a kind of sportier look, while still keeping the appealing appearance of the double row stitch down and the cap toe, which are emphasized even more with the high contrast, and overall, it doesn't really matter if the thread is too light, because this isn't trying to be an overly formal boot anyways. Speaking of the cap toe, it is a true cap toe, so there is indeed another layer of leather on the upper, not just cosmetic stitching. Aside from the 2 layers of upper leather, there's thermoplastic in the toe box, which as you may know is not uncommon in heritage boots, as it helps keep the structure at the front of the boot, so it doesn't sag and collapse in the long term. After that, there's the lining leather on the inside of the boot, for a grand total of 4 layers of material over the toes. What this means is more than enough protection for everyday use, and a super solid cap toe that still firmly maintains its shape even after a year of wear and hundreds of miles. Definitely more rigid than these Viberg Navy boots, which have a leather toe puff, so the cap toe is still firm but not as rigid as the Parkhurst. The area closer to the stitching and the vamp are a bit softer, but not by much. Make no mistake, this is no safety toe, but it will give you ample protection for daily wear, and the durable structure means the boots will keep maintaining their emphasized cap toe expression well into the future. Interestingly, the heel counter remains quite rigid compared to my Parkhurst Niagara boots, which seem to soften up relatively quickly. The heel counter is leather, which Andrew explained can be a bit softer or a bit firmer because of what has been used at different times in the past. He elaborated by saying it can also depend on what upper leather the counter is paired with, because we're feeling it from the outside, which can make us think sometimes that it feels less firm if the upper leather is thinner or more refined, and that the converse of that is true if the counters are paired with a thicker upper leather. Then the whole area to the touch will feel firmer. I also learned that because heel counters are usually stiff and firm, they're typically a common point of break-in, which is why Parkhurst had been using more pliable leather recently, due to break-in problems with the heel sometimes. In any case, whether it's the Richmond boots, which feel like they have a firmer heel counter, or the Niagaras, which feel like they have a softer heel counter, both conform to my heels and maintained structure, especially at the bottom, which is comparatively stiffer than the middle and top for both pairs. As long as the bottom half of the heel counters are rigid enough, which has been my case with these Richmonds and the Niagaras, and almost every other heritage boot I've worn, there won't be much issue with them maintaining their structure over time to support and grip my heels. In general, the bottom half of heel counters will be relatively more rigid than the top half, which softens, allowing for more adaptation towards the taper at the top of the heel. That difference in firmness from bottom to top is a key fit characteristic of heritage boots. Having some give and flexibility at the top of the heel counter, transitioning to the backstay, is important because there's more articulation there going further up the Achilles tendon compared to the essentially solid and static heel bone below. So as long as the heel counters aren't fully floppy and structureless, I haven't had any major issues with softer heel counters that I can press down on, as long as they conform close enough to those vital contours at the lower half of the Achilles tendon and heel bone. The heel counters of the Niagaras didn't present much of an issue compared to the Richmonds because it took me wearing the Niagaras about 3 to 4 months for me to notice them conforming to my heels, compared to the same thing taking about 5 to 6 months with the Richmonds, all the while being more stiff overall. The main issue was heel rub for my slightly smaller foot, which has happened with other boots. When these were new during the first few weeks, I took it easy, but sometimes got carried away and wore these longer, leading to a minor callus on the back of my heel. This happened maybe 2 or 3 times, and I took a break for at least 3 days when that did happen. And that was about one of the worst experiences during the start of the break-in. The bulk of this unpleasantness lasted for about 3 months. Even if I wore thicker socks or tightened the laces more, I would still have these issues but to a lesser degree, so I just kept going, and now I don't have any of these issues. The firmness and shape of the heel counters, contributing to heel slip and heel rub, was mostly confined to the break-in period, and to a limited extent. Instead, the bigger factor was something quite common with new heritage boots, when the insole and midsole haven't broken in yet. This was especially true for these Richmonds because, like the Niagaras, they use a relatively hard leather. When the leather underfoot hasn't conformed to the shape of your feet yet, your feet won't completely move and flex in sync with the boot. And that will lead to more rubbing, often with the back and sometimes the bottom of the heel. The Parkhurst website often refers to this as bend the leather on product pages. For example, describing the insole as a vegetable tanned bend the leather, and the heel stack as a vegetable tanned Ben's leather, cut from our insole leather. I wasn't sure what that meant, so I asked Andrew, and he clarified by saying, Ben's is the most dense part of the cow's skin, and that's why it's great for use as soling leather, all those leather components under the feet, including the heel stack. After those first few months, when it felt like I was walking on hardwood, the comfort began to improve while maintaining a firm base of support. Although this is the case with all heritage boots that use leather for the insole, midsole, and heel block, like Grant Stone and Viberg, which I have reviewed in the past, I would say Parkhurst is noticeably more supportive in terms of firmness, with the trade-off of a longer break-in, and not being as good to stand on hard surfaces like concrete for hours at a time. Nonetheless, the past year of wear has roughly been even, with me walking on hard surfaces in urban areas, and more soft surfaces in rural and wilderness areas, where the firmness becomes a comfortable benefit. From my experience, I find the leather from Parkhurst boots under the feet to be more rigid to the point where it pushes back up more like a firm mattress or pillow in comparison to other boots I wear. However, Grant Stone and Viberg have more noticeable arch support in comparison to Parkhurst. In this regard, we're talking about shape from under the feet, not firmness. In any case, it doesn't really matter for me since I don't need arch support in daily wear. And I would say this could also apply to a lot of people, unless they have really weak and flat feet, perhaps a deficiency or injury at that area, or just can't live without their preferred arch support. It's also been my experience that Ben's leather on all Parkhurst boots I've worn is much tougher and more abrasion resistant, mostly again in comparison to Grant Stone and Viberg, because those are the other boot brands I've worn and reviewed the most. Just look at this clip from about the 1 year mark. After a thorough cleaning, it's holding up quite well, especially along the back and middle. There's a bit of damage at the front, but even then that portion has minimal chipping. And that's impressive, especially after some of what it's been through. The leather used for the midsole in particular for those other boots isn't bad per se. It just means that, especially if you're walking in an area with lots of rocks and branches, for example, or even if you scrape some concrete, the soling leather for Parkhurst boots will have a significantly lower chance of scratching or forming dents. The scrapes for those other boots will usually just lead to some very shallow damage at a cosmetic level, not structural around the midsole or heel block. From my experience, Parkhurst has a rougher finish around the midsole and heel block, which again is not to say it's worse or better than Grant Stone or Viberg. I'm mostly referring to the feel. You can feel that it's rougher in relation to Viberg and Grant Stone, which have very smooth and fine finishing. This difference can be seen up close, but realistically, at standing height, this difference will be difficult to see. And this got me thinking, the finer smooth finishing on the surface can be damaged more easily, whereas less finishing or rougher finishing doesn't get damaged as easily. So even if you had midsoles and heel blocks made of the same leather, but one boot was rougher finishing and one boot was smoother finishing, it would be like the smoother finishing is glossier paint that can be damaged more easily, and that damage would be more visible. In regards to shock absorption on harder surfaces, I noticed the Richmond is alright given the harder leather underfoot. So it's a welcome improvement from my experience with the Niagara. But it's not as comfortable as the almost sneaker-like cushioning I felt with the Parkhurst Calvin Chukka boots. This means I can walk for several hours at a time on concrete and feel minimal fatigue, and definitely no pain, especially after the insoles were thoroughly broken in past the 6-month mark. But even then, just like any other boots or footwear in general, I can still feel tired if I've worn these on concrete closer to 10 hours. And that becomes worse if, like I mentioned before, I'm standing for a long time rather than walking. Extra cushioning at the heel area comes from a small piece of foam under the heel pad. which, like thermoplastic at the toe box, is not unheard of and can actually be quite common in heritage boots. Over the last year, there's been some very minor compression of this cushioning. Because it's such a small and thin portion of the boot, natural compression of the foam over time only marginally affects comfort and feel. Once heel pad compression began, the leather components under feet were already well underway with their break-in, and that essentially cancelled out any minor decreases in comfort from compression of heel pad foam. That's been my experience with Parkhurst and all other heritage boots that use foam at the heel pad. As for why I feel these are more comfortable than the old version of the Niagaras I have, it mostly comes down to the soling leather. This is because both pairs are veg tanned leather, but the Richmond is more flexible because of longer tanning. Andrew revealed the reason is because the Stitchdown build ran a risk of being too stiff of a build for quicker comfort. So he decided to use insoles that were tanned longer and with more oils, to help make the boot overall more flexible by starting with what he referred to as the chassis of the boot, the insole. He continued by saying, "But our Stitchdown build now has been made to be quite flexible actually due to a few construction steps we changed around. So I don't foresee us using that extra tannage again really. We'll likely just stick to the same recipe with a couple of suppliers we work with that the welted insoles use, and then pair that with the build we have for Stitchdown. We have experimented with different forms of cushioning and heel pads all throughout manufacturing, and I think we're in a good spot now with current and new items coming out in this regard to heel pads and insoles. Naturally, if there's something better or more accessible, or which involves less risk without quality being sacrificed, we will change things slightly if necessary. In manufacturing, unanticipated instances come up all the time where you need to shift gears in order to move forward. Having learned that, I still wouldn't mind if later boots kept using this leather. It's some quality stuff I haven't quite found a match for in other boots. And that could definitely be because of the longer tanning process with more oils. A small comment about more oils. I remember when I first unboxed these and felt a very slight slickness on the midsole and heel block, but I didn't appear to get any oil on my fingers. It's not really important, just something unique I noticed, and is likely due to the higher oil content in all components including the upper. One detail that did detract from my first impressions and actually concerned me a little was the heel block, which has a bit of extra material protruding at the corners towards the front. It's a bit larger at this area, so it doesn't line up in a neat column like every other heritage boot I have, including other Parkhurst boots. It isn't really visible unless you go extremely close, so it's not a big deal looks-wise. Nonetheless, I thought it could increase the chances of delamination and separation, because if I somehow caught those exposed portions under something, then lifted my heel just right, it could start peeling the heel block. Fortunately, it turns out that was highly irrational. Because it's such a small portion that's exposed, even if I tried to create those conditions intentionally, getting enough leverage would be extremely hard, as I would be contacting less than 1 millimeter of exposed area. Technically, getting separation at that area is possible as shown by these Grant Stone boots in Loden suede that I reviewed in my first ever video. It's a combination of luck and the right conditions, which if you're unfortunate enough to experience, the combination of glue and nails at that area will prevent the entire section from separating. Now let's talk about the design of the 618 last and how that relates to comfort, sizing, fit, and aesthetics. The 618 last was designed first for the switch to Stitchdown construction boots, with the peak width just over a single E, but not touching a double E, according to the store page. Yet it was still recommended to go down half a size with the example of, if you're a 10D Brannock or slightly over a D width, go with size 9.5 in the 618 last. I was a little hesitant seeing that peak width, but following general sizing advice for Parkhurst and other boots never steered me wrong. Just like the Niagaras, I went down half a size from my Brannock measurement, because I have standard D width feet. And I can say I'm satisfied, but I did have my doubts during that 4 to 6 month break-in period. This goes back to heel rub and stiff insoles at the beginning, which somewhat distorted my initial thoughts on what actually turns out to be a more extreme interpretation of a combination last that has a pronounced and intentional taper narrowing from the middle to back of the boots. Now, before I go further, I should also mention that even though I'm a standard D width, I have proportionally longer toes, and the back half of my foot is noticeably narrower than the front half to a degree that seems more than normal, but not to a point where it's an extreme taper. I haven't done the measurements, but I would say my arches are moderate, not flat or high, and my instep is above average but not super high, just based on me having issues at the midfoot more often than most people. With that background out of the way, I was satisfied right away, because that aggressive taper from the waist to the heel suited the back half of my feet, especially from the sides at the midfoot area, just as expected. But just because of the heel slip and rubbing I mentioned, it wasn't a perfectly pleasant experience right away. In terms of the instep, I first felt that it was a bit lower than the 602M last the Niagaras I have are based on. In general, there was more concentrated pressure compared to other heritage boots I've worn. That being said, it was still a relatively light pressure that gradually eased off, mostly because this relatively soft upper material softened up even more. But that minor pressure still took away from comfort even up until the 8-month mark. By then it was to a very low degree, as it would soon disappear. This experience is also because the 618 last feels like it curves more aggressively in the front, from the top of the shaft to the tip of the toe, even though it may appear to be a standard, gentle curve from the outside. For me, it's a shape that ends up feeling more like a right angle than a gradual curve, just because of my higher than average instep and the shape of the top of my feet. What I mean by right angle is it's like the curve at the instep area is literally a sharper angle. At least it feels that way on my instep, as opposed to a more gradual curve that distributes the pressure more evenly. A side effect of this is the tongue tends to go backwards unless you fully fold it forward, and it stays in place very well, not shifting from side to side. But that means, for people like me, you have to undo the laces a bit more when you're taking them off, pulling them more at the eyelets after you undo the speed hooks. But on the positive side, it ensures a more snug and secure fit, which is comfortable after the long period where the leather eventually softens up and conforms to that more acute angle of an area. So that pressure goes from being slightly uncomfortable to the good kind of snug fit. Then just like these Alden Indy boots, there's a piece of leather going around inside at the top. Except unlike the Alden Indy, which has clean, secure finishing, the bottom part of this area flares out and is not secured down. I was concerned about the possibility of peeling when taking my feet out of the boots. But after doing that for a whole year, there's no separation. You could technically peel it off if you intentionally pinched it and pulled with force. But in terms of regular wear separating that area, it's highly unlikely. Though it is an area that can be improved on in the future. My Niagaras don't have this issue since it's smooth lining to the top. Taken directly from the store page, the 618 last is described as, quote, designed first for our stitch-down constructed boots. The 618 draws from both the original 602 and original 18 lasts, while incorporating some new design aspects. It features a bit more tapered heel than the 602, a slight point to the toe, and a lower volume than the 602 last. And as stated before, the peak width on this last at Brannock is just over a single E, but not touching a double E. That peak width is somewhat polarizing for me because I do appreciate the extra horizontal room. Like most people, I don't like to have my toes pressed together from the sides. However, it was and is still to an extent, a little too much extra room on the sides. Unless I'm standing or sitting for a very long time, then it's very much appreciated. Naturally, my feet would tend to slide from side to side. This was uncomfortable and even painful at times for the first half year. That made me doubt the fit, a lot more so than the instep and heel rub issues I talked about earlier. Because even though the instep was a problem, it was relatively light pressure, so tightening down the laces never really became a big deal. It never got anywhere near painful, at most just a little too snug at times. So at the beginning, tightening down the laces was a viable option to help decrease how much my feet were sliding in the boots. Over time, sliding from side to side or back and forth began to subside because my feet began to sink into the footbed, or insole if you prefer. And I got to a point where there was enough wear on the surface of the footbed so that it wasn't too smooth. I don't know if you have this problem, but even if a boot isn't that wide, my feet will often slide when they're new, because there's less friction when the footbed is still smooth. Wearing thicker socks helped, but my feet still moved around until they fully imprinted into the footbed and friction increased. When talking about sliding forward in particular, it can still happen now, but to a much lower degree. Mostly when I'm on uneven ground or going downhill for an extended period of time. If the laces aren't tightened and I'm not wearing thicker socks. For toe fit in particular, the more symmetrical and rounded toe box is a step up from the 602M last, because it basically doesn't give my toes issues. It's basically the least pressure I've ever felt on the pinky toe of my slightly larger foot. What little pressure there was began to go away after 2 months. Vertically, there's enough height so there's little to no pressure bearing down on my toes. As for some of the main reasons for the switch from the 602M to the 618 last, Andrew highlighted how the 602M was too high volume for people, and the volume needed to be reduced. In trying to reduce the volume on the 602M, so many things needed to change in order to properly balance the last proportions, that it was just better to create a new last at that point. He then informed me that there will be a move back to the original 602 last, with some width and contour modification soon. I've never worn the original 602. From what I was told, it had volume between the 602M and the 618. More than the 618, but slightly less than the 602M. As a result, the 618 will be discontinued as part of this move. It demonstrates how Parkhurst can be quick to adapt and evolve to feedback, because as Andrew elaborated, a large part of using different lasts is trying to cater to different parts of the market, and trying to see just how big these parts are and how they respond. Some good data has been collected over the past few years with the few different lasts used, and production decisions will be made from that sales data and customer feedback. During the unboxing last year, I began recording an extensive comparison to show the differences in last design compared to other boots I have. But it quickly got out of hand, and I think I'll just make a separate mega boot comparison someday. To keep this already long video shorter and more relevant, I will still do a last comparison, but mainly focus on shape and how that relates to fit, because that aggressive taper towards the back half does fit like what you would expect. It's indeed a very noticeable narrowing, and most of the tighter grip at the heel and waist around the midfoot grips my feet well, but mostly because of the narrowness, and not so much the contours. So it's good to hear Andrew's adjustments will involve the contours. Before I bought these and was looking online to see what people thought of the 618 last, I heard some people don't like it because it appears to throw off proportions. I would agree, but only at certain angles, from a first-person view at standing height when you're wearing the boots. Sometimes it kind of reminds me of a cartoon depiction of a fish out of water, where the mouth will swell up a lot, while the rest of the fish is very narrow. and I think it's this drastic width difference from front to back that people don't like the look of, mostly when they're putting their boots on or taking them off, because as you see here, it's only really more visible when the pant leg is lifted up, or when the feet rotate to certain angles. Anyways, let's start by looking at the heel in comparison to Grant Stone's Leolast. I feel as though the 618 has a tighter hold on my ankles, but over a smaller surface area. So in some ways, it could be described as a firm pinch, whereas the Grant Stones hold a bit less closely, mostly in terms of being a bit wider, and to a lesser extent the contours, that include going vertically and diagonally across the heel counter. But I do like how the Leolast feels like it's a fuller grip, covering more surface area around the heel. When talking just about the vertical aspect of the curve going up from the heel counter to the backstay, there are some slight differences, but they don't make a big difference between these two lasts. Check that out, the 618 last in between two Grant Stone boots on the Leolast. In comparison, the Viberg 2030 last is still the best last at the heel area for me, because it has that more full gripping feeling over a larger area like the Leolast, combined with a closer, firmer grip without having a pinch-like feeling that the 618 last sometimes gives. By pinch-like grip, I mean a narrower grip over a smaller surface area. Not literal pinching like with your thumb and index finger on a small spot. An analogy is like the 2030 is a full grip with fingers fully wrapped around a shovel or barbell, while the 618 is like when you grab the spine of a book off a shelf. The 2030's curves are vertically and horizontally optimized to lock in the heel with even more comfortable pressure. For me, it's a near perfect bell curve shape from the bottom of the backstay to the top of the heel counter that adapts well to the transition from the Achilles tendon to the heel bone. That shape was apparently designed to accommodate more heel types, largely achieved by the contours at the upper portion of the heel counter. So the 618, Leolast, and even 602M last have alright contours at the upper portion of the heel counter, but they, along with every other last I've tried, pale in comparison to the contours of the Viberg 2030. Then the famous Alden Indy's heel counter isn't that remarkable in the vertical dimension. It doesn't look or feel like it from the outside, but when wearing them, the top of the heel counter just feels a bit lower and looser than the others, just because of how it's curved and shaped at the top. However, it has the fullest fit and grip at the bottom half in terms of surface area. As you may know, the heel counter extends further forward to provide support towards the midfoot. That is really where it shines, and one of the main reasons why so many people say it's such a comfortable last. The contours at the back and bottom half are good, but they just don't arc around the heels as closely as the others. At the waist or midfoot area along the sides, the Alden Indy's taper feels more aggressive than the Grant Stone Leo, but less than the 618. These are small differences, but they do have a noticeable impact on fit and feel. However, like the heel area, nothing is better for me than the Viberg 2030. Narrowness is important, but smaller measurements alone aren't enough. It's also the shape and the right kind of gradual taper with the contours, vertically and horizontally. They really make a difference in how the grip cradles the feet without being restrictive, or giving a pinch-like feeling over a smaller area. Still staying with the midfoot area but going up to the instep, the Viberg 2030's instep pushes down with just a very little bit more pressure than the 618, but it does so more evenly over a larger area, as opposed to what I said earlier about the 618 concentrating more at a smaller spot on the instep. The upper leather also makes a difference. This cigar Viking leather, for example, is soft and pliable after being worn in, to the point now where it has a similar feel to the dark olive roughout in terms of how its softness contributes to conforming with the shape of the instep. However, if the break-in isn't complete yet, or the material is stiffer like this earth chamois, it can feel more restrictive and misshapen even though it's on the same 2030 last. In contrast, the Alden Indy feels like it has a very relaxed instep. It combines more generous space at that area with a looser and more flexible upper material. It is rough out like the Parkhurst Richmond and the earth chamois on the Viberg Navy boot, but this has no treatment, no oils and waxes added, so it's not firm and rigid even when it's new. Like the Vibergs, it also has no gusset, whereas the Parkhurst and Grant Stone boots all have half gussets. That's why I haven't really found the gusset, or absence of a gusset, to be a major factor in how the instep feels. When talking about the sides of the upper at the midfoot area, combined with the unique extended heel counter, the Alden Indy manages to cradle the feet comfortably without using higher pressure or tension at any particular area that narrows a lot. That's why even though the Alden Indy has the most relaxed fit for me, it's still a secure enough fit that's comfortable, especially since I just mostly wear it on firmer and flatter ground. The Grant Stone Leolast is more secure than the Alden Indy. It applies a bit more pressure at the instep and heel area, because regardless of the upper leather being used, the Leolast more closely approximates those areas. But it's not as snug as the 618 or the 2030. And overall, it distributes pressure moderately well. Turning our attention to the very top, the 618 and 2030 taper for a secure but not too restrictive fit. However, when taking off and putting on the boots, you need to do more work with the laces, due to that narrower opening that extends down to the instep. That's why you can see more rolling and folding marks from the ankle bones, even though I don't excessively kneel or crouch down in these boots. This could happen to the Viberg boots too, but I don't wear them as roughly as the Parkhurst, and their exceedingly high leather clicking quality means the grain structure is generally tighter. The volume for Grant Stone from the middle to upper portion is moderate, leaning just a bit more generous, so it strikes a good balance, and generally I have less marks around the ankle area, but that can also depend on the leather and how I wear the boots. The Alden Indy is least prone to these marks because of its generous fit extending up towards the top. If I want a closer fit at the top, remotely close to the other boots, I really need to tighten down the laces. A benefit of this greater volume is the boots are much easier to put on and take off. But of course, the lacing will still take time like the other boots. Going to the toe box, the 618 easily steps into first place, just for sheer volume, mostly width-wise. So for people like me with pinky toe pressure problems, it's the best of the bunch in that regard. However, this comes with the possible issue of more sliding, mostly before the boots are broken in, and if you wear thinner socks, as well as if you're walking downhill or on uneven ground for a long time. In terms of rounder shape, the 618 is quite similar to the 2030. Though the dimensions are noticeably narrower, it doesn't necessarily feel like the toes are being crammed together, it's just a much more noticeable snug fit from the sides, which I actually prefer more when walking on uneven ground or if I'm going downhill for a long time. And it usually isn't that much of a problem if I'm on firmer and flatter ground for less than a full day. The 2030 toe box is the lowest by far, so I do get pressure down onto my toes. Usually it's not that much of a problem since the Vibergs I have use leather toe puffs, so the pressure is softer. Vertical pressure along with a narrower toe box can help with more secure toes, in keeping with that design feature from Pacific Northwest boots, to reduce toe movement on uneven terrain. Grant Stone's toe box shape is good, but a small portion of people may get pressure on their big toe or pinky toe, depending on their toe splay and shape. So I do get some minor pressure on my pinky toe sometimes, whereas the Alden toe box is a great shape, at least for me and a lot of other people. It makes a great gradual arc down from the big toe to the pinky toe, with just enough room on the sides. So there's basically no side pressure like the 618, but without the slight excess in volume and width. Now, when it comes to adjusting the fit with the lacing, what I'll discuss generally applies to all boots. As is quite common, I keep the default lacing pattern with the classic crisscross. Because like most people, I find it gives a good balance between distributing pressure and controlling tension. Whenever possible, it's preferable to rest on something for an incline when lacing up. Even better if you can rest weight down onto the heel so that it goes straight to the back to remain in a more secure position. When doing the speed hooks, I usually give a little tug for some tension. If I'm going downhill or will be on uneven ground a lot, I'll pull with more force to limit how much my feet could slide around. Even though this method is faster, where you do 2 hooks at a time on the same side, and it is possible to control tension this way, I find I can more easily and better fine-tune fit like this with 2 hands, doing 2 speed hooks on opposite sides at once. Overall, this slower way gives a greater degree of control over tension. Somewhere around the 6-month mark, when I really began to notice improvements with the break-in, I started using the faster way more, and it was okay most of the time, especially on flat ground. But a few times I used this method without much tension before walking less than 10 kilometers on concrete and dirt paths, after which I felt a bit more tired than usual, along with some slight discomfort. The little bit of extra movement from the looser lacing led to almost a full week of pain on the underside of my foot, around that area where the joint for the big toe starts. After the pain noticeably went down, it took about another 2 weeks for the little bump at that area to go away. Overall, not that bad, but it could be quite painful if I shifted my weight just right sometimes. Using the faster way with less tension doesn't matter as much for higher boots, since there's more contact up the leg to help with fit. Though for the standard 6-inch height of most heritage boots, this does matter, since there's only contact up until around the ankle area. Then a few times I did similar loose lacing and didn't get that pain, though there was a lot of rubbing on the bottom of my heels. And after the discomfort went away within a day, I noticed that the skin, especially on one foot, started to break, leaving behind a soft patch of dead skin. Even though this was mostly due to movement from the loose lacing, it was also because my feet were drier at that time. So I just moisturized the area and the issue went away within about a week. There was only one time when that happened, when I had to take a break from these boots for about 2 days. Usually I wear medium weight wool socks and the fit is okay. If I want to reduce movement as much as possible, heavyweight socks basically get rid of most problems. Naturally, in warmer weather, when I tend to wear medium to lightweight socks, I tend to get more movement. Like when I wear these Camel City wool socks in their lightest weight version. Camel City wool socks, you know, from William, better known as Boot Spy. They really do have good ventilation. The structure is really helped by how the collar, toe box, and heel are reinforced, along with the bottom reinforcement with a kind of a rib knit pattern. Aside from the structured fit, there's also a minor beneficial compression. So they live up to his marketing claims for the most part. I can generally wear thinner socks and not have any issues with sliding in any direction, even on moderately uneven ground, when I use that method where the laces are wrapped around the shaft. I do this more with these than any other heritage boot, because they're the pair I wear to walk on uneven ground the most. For a while, I've been hesitant to talk about this lacing method and aspect of fit, so I never mentioned it in other reviews. Partly because it entails some health advice, but I thought Since I use this method a lot with these boots, and if I give a clear disclaimer that this is just my experience, and that you should take your own personal circumstances into account and consult a medical professional if necessary, then there shouldn't be any misunderstanding that might lead people to do something that might harm their health. With that out of the way, this slow motion footage with above average range of motion movement is meant to show how tying boot laces like this literally gives a fuller fit. It makes up for many issues with a loose fit by limiting movement. However, that comes with the trade-off of less mobility and more pressure. This can be uncomfortable, harmful, or even dangerous, because it can restrict ankle and overall foot articulation and blood flow. This could be especially problematic for people with bad ankle mobility and a sedentary lifestyle, which is a lot of the population. Aside from discomfort, it could also lead to injury. Not necessarily instant acute injury most of the time, but it could lead to chronic stiffness getting worse at that area, thereby increasing the chances of injury due to lacking range of motion, poor blood flow, and overall deficiency in stability. It could be another part of the body that gets injured, other than the ankles and feet, as forces get redistributed too unevenly in the long term. Most of this doesn't apply to me because I generally keep the benefits of conditioning from when I ran track and field. And I still do work on joint mobility, stability, and strength to avoid stiffness, weakness, and premature aging, along with just trying to keep a passable level of cardiovascular fitness to avoid bad circulation. Plus trying to avoid a sedentary lifestyle by being aware of how often and for how long I sit. It's a great habit I would still do even if I didn't wear boots or use this lacing method. I just want to make sure to outline the drawbacks of wearing boots and this lacing method in particular. It's also a reminder to consider your overall mobility beyond just the ankle and when you're wearing boots. To minimize the cons of this method, I also usually wrap the laces around my ankles and tie them down with minimal pressure, just enough to limit the bulk of extra unwanted movement in the boots. Kind of like how you would usually put on a seatbelt but not fasten it down to the maximum extent possible. If I use moderate to high pressure, the tightness can be constricting, to the point where it really limits how much I can move, especially on flat and firmer ground. Essentially, it feels like I'm wearing a cast when it's that tight. I don't need such a secure fit unless I'm making a steep climb on highly unstable surfaces, which I've never done in these boots. In most cases, when I use this method with a lighter pressure, there's minimal restriction and my feet still feel quite secure, while I get enough ankle mobility and protection, significantly cutting down the possibility of rolling an ankle, especially if I do something like unexpectedly slip on loose rocks and dirt. For everyday wear or to do some light work, you can see I can still get a pretty good range of motion. It's also possible to get what I call a more adaptive range of motion from adaptive tightness and pressure by wearing leather and some nylon laces that have a bit more stretch, because I find these materials can help with flexing, stretching, and contracting based on how my ankles are moving, and to a lesser extent the pliability of the upper leather and swelling of my feet when the temperature increases. But it's a very minor thing, and even if you use cotton laces, the experience won't be that much different. Nice small quality of life improvement though. Also, I usually prefer flat and or leather laces, just because flat laces provide more surface area to distribute lace tension, and they can get more friction to stay tied longer. Style-wise, leather laces just look better with leather boots, if we're talking about depth of texture in most cases. If we're talking about bright and a broad range of colors, it's usually synthetic, like these spare laces which came with my Danner hiking boots that I reviewed last year. This really does give an extreme pop of color, which is so bright. I mostly just wore this combination during darker winter days. Besides, it fits in around Christmas time. They don't look bad in bright sunlight, but sometimes they can be a bit loud. As for these default leather laces they came with, it's a nice classic contrast that works with most all heritage boots. Then for a lower contrast, there were these spare darker nylon laces. Their plainness helps the white stitching stand out more and adds emphasis to the cap toe. I was kind of surprised those default leather laces could fit my Vibergs, which at first glance seem like they have much smaller eyelets, but they did fit, albeit a bit tighter. These round blue laces that came as spares for some grandstones are okay. Green and blue are a complementary combination, but I find they don't stay tied as good as flat laces. Sometimes people may also not prefer this smaller diameter, being matched with these comparatively larger eyelets and speed hooks. Then for one of my favorite lace pairings, these green leather laces from Guarded Goods. I like that gradient effect from it being a green that's not too different or too similar, for a smooth transition and moderate contrast. The dark green uppers are a shade of green you'll find in nature, so if you have orange or yellow laces you could adapt them for a fall look like a pumpkin. Then in the spring and summer, they can be so versatile as to fit in with shades of pink and purple. The store page images were highly representative of how these boots look in real life, especially when they're new and uniform with no highlights and lowlights. Nor are the uppers a smooth leather, which can vary in appearance more depending on the lighting. Originally, I thought I'd do a section where I just commentate on how the dark olive roughout looks in different lighting conditions, and how it aged from unboxing throughout a year of wear. But I realized a bunch of those vlogging type updates would get repetitive. And you can see for yourself and judge how you like this leather, which is generally dark most of the time, even as the boots age and the finish wears off for lighter shades of green. Also, you've probably noticed by now there's a rich and deep texture, but that, along with the relatively minor variance in green, is only visible up close. And in almost all cases, these give off a uniform dark appearance at a distance. One of the only conditions where these will drastically differ in appearance is when there's overwhelmingly bright lighting all around. More interestingly, they can appear lighter when it's heavily overcast or raining, especially when on dark and wet pavement. It's an effect that can also be seen with these dark olive green pants. In general, boots with medium brown for the midsole and heel block almost look like they're gently glowing under these conditions, just because of how the lighting works out. Going into the technical details of dark olive waxed roughout, the store page description described it as the full grain waxed roughout article from the Charles F. Stead Tannery. The article was tanned to our specifications using both an oil base and a wax finish to allow ease of conditioning over time. This means you can use either a wax or an oil, as opposed to one or the other, to take care of the leather over time. The nap is finished with wax on the surface. Then it also explained that the primary color in this upper leather is a very dark olive green. Since it is an olive-named leather, you may see some subtle shades of brown as well depending on your lighting. Depending on the lighting and setting in which you have the boots, it will be common to see these colors and any slight variations of them. In comparison to Loden suede, that these plain-toe grandstone diesel boots are made from, this has much less brown shades, and it's a truer green that is actually more consistent. It's also more consistent than these Jungle Kangaroo grandstone diesel boots as well, which tend to show more variation. Partly also because Jungle Kangaroo is a smooth leather, giving it the dynamic ability to reflect and refract light, unlike the rough texture of suede and roughout. Yet Loden suede is still more variable in appearance than dark olive waxed roughout. All these boots have good build quality and look great in a wide range of conditions. Though if you're like me and generally prefer more consistency, and appreciate variation, but not as extreme and constant, the dark olive waxed roughout is the way to go. If you like more dynamic variation, Loden Suede and Jungle Kangaroo are better picks. In terms of texture and tannage, the most similar leather I have is Earth Chamois on these Viberg Navy boots. So it's not that surprising both these upper leathers have great performance and durability. Both are highly abrasion resistant to most things, especially to what you'll encounter in daily wear. The oil content in particular helps with repelling moisture and dirt, while keeping a relatively consistent appearance. It also keeps these leathers protected and hydrated for a long time. Even with the wax content, dark olive waxed roughout is still quite breathable, all things considered, similar to Earth Chamois. Of course, it won't be like a regular suede, but I can tolerate wearing them in the summer sun and in temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. It certainly isn't the most comfortable thing, but it's not as bad as one might think. In autumn and spring, they're pretty good at regulating temperature, making them great to wear when the weather will change a lot in the course of a single day. Like most heritage boots, they keep my feet warm enough down to the freezing point. Then, depending on how used to cold weather you are and what kind of socks you're wearing, these could still be comfortable down to -5 or even -10 degrees Celsius. The top of your feet will usually feel the chill quickest, especially if you slow down or stop moving. The oil and wax content definitely helps with protection from the cold. But if it's windy and snow keeps gathering on the uppers, it can only slow down heat loss so much. The outsoles do a decent job at reducing the heat conduction away from the bottom of the feet. But the Ridgeway soles on my Viberg Navy boots are a small step above because they're thicker and denser. Dark olive waxed roughout is quite pliable and flexible, even when new, but still manages to maintain decent structure when broken in. Earth Chamois, on the other hand, maintains a relatively firm temper, even as it gains pliability from break-in. Water resistance was one of the first things I tested. Maybe I did it a little too early because within the first month, when I should have been taking it easier, I got carried away when I first dipped these in water and ended up walking a lot more than I planned. So I did have sore feet, but I was very satisfied that I had dry feet from the water repellency working right out of the box, since I didn't add any treatment like conditioner or spray when the boots were new. I really do appreciate the water resistance along with the dirt repellency. So I often won't think twice going through puddles that most people would avoid, and don't mind getting them wet in all kinds of conditions. But just because I don't mind, and because they're water resistant, it doesn't mean they're fully waterproof. I never did get my feet wet, but just like other leather footwear, if you're submerged long enough, water will eventually get through. And too much constant exposure to high levels of moisture could theoretically degrade the leather, as well as everything binding the layers together. So while I usually don't mind getting them wet, I do try to get out of water as fast as possible if it's covering the boots closer to the top eyelet around where the half gusset ends. Realistically, I would be in water for 30 seconds at most to do things like go through streams, puddles, and cross small rivers. Though if it is possible, and not too inconvenient, I will still try to go around water sometimes. Especially if there's mud involved, because I don't want to track dirt into a car or some indoor place I'll usually go to after. If you do get covered in mud, a fun way to clean is to hose off the boots. As long as you just spray the bottom half, no water should get in. Even if the inside does get a bit wet, pour out the water and wipe down if necessary, then let it dry out and everything should be fine. When I first cleaned like this, something interesting happened. The upper leather actually appeared darker even after it dried. For comparison, look at the boot that's meant for the left foot and the lighter boot that's meant for the right foot. Maybe the oils were redistributed on the surface, or some oils from below managed to go up to the surface, making the upper darker again because the upper around the toe felt more oily again. Though I must say this only happened that one time, and I was never able to replicate the results. Overall, just like earth chamois, I think it's mostly the oil content that helps consistency, so it doesn't show that much variability with age. And most of the lightening is because of wax being removed. It's not like a heavy waxed leather, but that bit of wax does contribute to the lightening areas being more visible. Speaking of wax, here is a Horween waxed flesh leather watch strap. It has a similar texture but is more shiny. And there's more variation with the contrast between lighter and darker shades because of that higher wax content to demonstrate my point. Turning things over, here it is with the rough side of a green veg-tanned leather watch strap. It's darker at some spots, similar to the dark olive waxed rough out, because of direct contact with my skin. In sharp contrast, the lighter areas have less contact with my skin, and are almost like those green leather laces. It just goes to show the darkening effect of oil. As you probably guessed, these leathers rarely need conditioning, though I would still recommend cleaning at least on a semi-regular basis, especially if you get mud, sand, or salt on them. Basically anything that could be drying or abrasive. After spraying down with the hose, the bulk of moisture was dried off within an hour, and it was about 3 to 4 hours when almost all the upper was dry to the touch. Out of curiosity and just to be thorough, I wanted to include a care segment to show what conditioning this leather could look like. I consulted Andrew and he said if they were to be conditioned, he suggested using oil or a thinner liquid applicant to avoid the possibility of wax or balm getting bunched up in the nap of the leather when using cream or balm. To completely avoid the possibility of changing the leather, he suggested using a spray just like what you would use for plain suede. Regular maintenance and cleaning could just involve a stiffer brass brush for dirt that's more stuck, or just a regular firm suede silicone brush to remove dust. For comparison, here's a brushed boot on the right and a mostly unbrushed boot on the left. You could use a damp rag in some cases if you need to dissolve something, or if it helps with getting rid of more liquefied dirt like spilled drinks or salt brine from melting snow. I suppose you could use a suede shampoo if it's really dirty or has a liquid that could stain, but I haven't tried that yet because I usually just hose them off if they're really dirty. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me after I cleaned the boots more thoroughly near the 1-year mark. I first applied a little too much Venetian shoe cream, which is a fairly common conditioner that's sometimes recommended for waxed suede, and even oiled roughouts. Then I tried Saphir Renovator, which is well known for being a thicker, waxier conditioner. Next, for the thinner liquid applicant, I tried Saphir Conditioner for oiled leather, which is closer to a liquid consistency. Lastly, the oil I chose was jojoba oil because it's not too thick or thin, so it's a good middle ground on the oil consistency spectrum, and it doesn't have a strong odor or smell, which you may or may not prefer with things like coconut or olive oil, or some specially formulated oil blends for oiled leather conditioning. And here's a quick look at the tongue without treatment to show how lacing pressure can compress areas and concentrate oil to make them darker, along with lighter areas where creasing is stronger. After 3 days of drying, you can see the appearance of the conditioning for yourself. There's been a minor decrease in the sheen from wax content. As expected, the Venetian shoe cream and especially Saphir Renovator essentially crusted over and formed firmer patches. Whereas the thinner oiled leather conditioner only hardened the leather a bit. While the jojoba oil feels like it had a minor softening effect. A week later, or 10 days after initial application, the sheen decreased even more, while the conditioned areas with greater wax content hardened some more. While the oiled leather conditioner area stayed about the same. Then the jojoba oil area essentially returned the factory finish in terms of appearance and feel, along with improving the smell up close, though the pliability is of course softer after break-in. I should say my phone camera that I used for all this footage in this entire documentary review captured how these boots look quite accurately in all conditions. And there are no video effects or color grading, none of that stuff. Still, I should bring attention to the fact that these close-up shots tend to emphasize contrast more. Which isn't a false rendition per se, it just really magnifies the differences in light and dark areas when there's a sheen. So in real life, if you go back even just a little bit, like the distance right now, it's closer to what most people will see from a reasonable distance at least 1 foot away, where you start to see much less sheen and color variation, particularly with this oiled part. Reconditioned or not, this leather is also abrasion resistant and self-healing to an extent because of the fuzzy fiber structure, so scratching is easily removed in most cases just by rubbing the area with your bare fingers. That is, if abrasion can even make visible scratch marks in the first place. And these properties of rough-out leather can be improved with the addition of oils and waxes. Just for some contrast, here's the difference compared to regular suede. Then the similar earth chamois oiled rough-out. Somewhere between regular suede and oiled rough-out is this Alden Indy. It's a less fuzzy rough-out and has no treatment with added oils and waxes. Briefly going back to the break-in for those first few weeks, when the relatively pliable upper was still slightly softening, I did feel minor irritation on my feet. This left its mark in the form of rolling and creasing, such as at the vamp just before the cap toe begins. Likewise at the top of the boot, similar marks show how the uppers conformed to my ankle bones for a more secure and comfortable fit. There could be more intense rolling and creasing at these areas in particular if you crouch and kneel a lot, but I usually don't do that too often in these and other heritage boots. Looking to the future, I asked Andrew if this exact boot will be brought back, and if dark olive waxed roughout will return in future boots, as well as if he would consider having a few staple leathers and builds, or will it still mostly be limited runs? His answer was, there are no plans to bring this boot back, and that Parkhurst is getting to the point where a few staple leathers might stick around, but naturally they might go through phases where they need to be restocked. This would be the ideal situation, at least throughout the year, or a 12-month period, though he doesn't have any leathers or builds to disclose yet if it were to happen. He went on to say, having a staple line is a tricky balance and a risk because it sits, and it sits usually for a long time, like you see with most brands who have a staple line of say 4 to 5 leathers, all the same all the time. It's something sort of in the old days that long-established brands typically can do, or if the company's production cost is so very low enough that they can afford to keep a staple line around to sit. Producing in Europe, the costs are extremely high producing stock boots as it is. Labor in Europe is massively expensive, but many of the factories and suppliers there are well versed in what they're doing, and they have the good track record. Maybe it could work with an MTO version of a core line by stocking the uppers only. Additional boot making and other components will sit, plus build time risk until shipping to customer, for just one color and leather for each, with no guarantee on a time frame or return on the investment. His answer ended with, all we can do is project and hope we meet or beat projections through our efforts. Well, that's disappointing for people interested in this dark olive waxed roughout Richmond cap toe makeup, at least for now. This shortcoming with inventory is mostly a downside for small micro brands like Parkhurst, which have sprung up over the past decade or so, but it's understandable given how they're operating and still manage to deliver a good price to quality ratio, along with different and unique designs, by cutting down on cost and risk that comes with storing and holding inventory for a long time. Who knows, this or something very similar to it could return in the future, if perhaps there is heavy demand for it and there is ample stock of materials to make it. Moving down to the very bottom of the boots with the rubber outsole, I noticed it was basically the same consistency and density of rubber as my Niagara boots. So part of the reason why the Richmond is more comfortable also likely comes down to the heel pad and thinner heel block, which might also decrease the heel to toe drop ratio when combined with the fact that the front is raised by the tread pattern. In response, Andrew confirmed that the rubber is pretty much the same. No huge differences were made between each, though he did mention that the difference is the design and shape of the outsole has gone through a few different patterns and treads, explaining that industry average abrasion tests for rubber soles in footwear in general are around 100 to 120, with Parkhurst standard at 140, slightly higher intentionally. He continued by saying, different combinations of many materials, patterns, and builds will naturally make for a different feel. A sole with a deeper tread will not feel the same as a sole with a flat tread. You can always take something away from somewhere, and the feel can change. But sizing won't change unless the last changes. Nothing surprising with that. This strengthens my belief that most of the comfort from the Richmond underfeet is mostly down to the leather being softer and more flexible. But I really do think that extra oil tannage, and perhaps the Stitchdown build, also added flexibility and softness, to a small degree that is noticeable for comfort. Then I would say the rubber durability is about the same, which makes sense, given that this is almost the same as the Niagara. Though naturally the Richmond is lasting longer just because of the larger tread at the heel, as opposed to the comparatively thinner flat top lift for the Niagara, but they do wear down at about the same rate. This wear is just like I covered in the Niagara review. The rubber tends to peel off in flakes that are quite noticeable at first, then it eventually slows down. The tread is basically the same as the classic Vibram Commando tread, except the treads don't go all the way out to the edge in order to accommodate the stitching on the sides. Theoretically, this would reduce traction and stability since there is less surface area with the treads, but in everyday wear it doesn't really matter. And it shouldn't really matter unless you're ascending an icy mountain or if you're going to be going uphill for a long time with lots of loose rocks and sand. That being said, going all the way out to the edges could contribute to small improvements in comfort, along with stability and traction. But then that would mean the sole needs to be glued on, or a channel needs to be made for the stitching, or the stitching just goes on the edge without a channel, but more roughly along the treads. The front has comparatively much less wear, just because like most people, I'll strike the treads at the front at a flatter angle. Now for some reference, here's the Honey Vibram sole with the Chukka boots, which have the same tread pattern, but it goes all the way to the edge. I don't have a proper black Vibram Commando sole, but I do have a scale rubber model with a keychain. It also demonstrates that difference treads all the way to the edge. I can't really speak about the black Vibram sole and how durable it is, or how comfortable it is since I don't have a full-sized version on an actual boot. And I don't have enough wear with the Honey Vibram sole here because the boots never really fit me that well, so I never wore them that much. It is a softer compound in this tread pattern, so it is more comfortable. Since the treads go all the way to the edge, and I have worn them enough, I can say that it does make a minor difference in terms of comfort and stability. But it's not a make or break it difference, because again, in average daily wear, and even in rougher conditions, it doesn't make a huge difference to matter that much. But in terms of harsher conditions with less traction, and longevity with a harder rubber compound over time, I can't really speak to that since I don't have experience with the proper Vibram sole. Talking traction, regular rain is not an issue if we're talking about wet concrete, but if it's wet tile, do still proceed with caution. I tried recording clips walking in mud but only got a first-person view because I didn't want my phone to fall in the mud by accident, even though traction was pretty good. You will still have instability on really muddy ground, especially when there's some surface tension from highly saturated mud, which makes for a slick surface when your treads aren't stuck firmly in the mud. When the soles are imprinting into the mud, instability can come from suction and stickiness when pulling up. Gravel and rocks are okay, especially when they're not wet, but there's always the chance for some portions to be loose and for some rolling to happen. There can also be sharper debris in there, which can be one of the things that wears down the soles faster, even if the front half of the tread pattern is landing flatter. Performance on snow is good. Then on ice, the rubber and tread pattern can only help so much, so be careful. So far, the only time I slipped unexpectedly was when I stepped on some very fine sand and gravel, which was covering a patch of concrete that was on a slight decline. But those very small fine particles were round and smooth, which really reduced friction. That kind of debris that tends to form from water running downhill might look like sandpaper, but it can be quite slippery. Not so much like ice or mud, more like the kind of rolling instability. Luckily, it was a small patch and only one foot contacted that area, so my foot just slid quickly over a short distance, maybe around a foot at most. Luckily, in the end, I didn't get injured. A trade-off of decent traction on snow and mud is that The tread will often collect snow and mud, especially with the back half, which tends to have more contact and pressure. And it's not uncommon to find small sticks and rocks wedged in. Overall, the past year of wear over hundreds of miles has been a roughly even distribution on urban and natural terrain. I would say this is quite representative of most people without going to either extreme, where some wear heritage boots like hiking or work boots all the time, and try to wear them out just for the sake of wearing them out. It's also not like the other extreme when they're just worn indoors on carpet and clean, smooth flooring most of the time. It's a nice mix of lifestyle that more people can relate to. That's mainly urban around half the time, a quarter rural, and a quarter outdoors, in parks, on trails close to the city, or forest, mountain, and other wilderness areas much further away from urban areas. It covers a bunch of situations that heritage boots could be worn in for a large chunk of the population worldwide. Going back to the overall hardness of the rubber and leather underfoot, here are some sound samples people may be interested in. If you're walking around large rocks and compacted soil, it will still sound quite a lot like concrete. Next, some soft steps on aggregate in front of a concrete wall. Smaller rocks and gravel. Next, walking normally for the most part in a spacious indoor area with flat and smooth flooring that's kind of hollow under. Same thing, but more close up and with more variation in stomping. Next, in a similar area but with more noisy ambient noise, in a totally not sponsored segment. On softer surfaces, like carpet, grass, and leaves, they might be a bit louder than other footwear, with a bit of extra thud, but overall still soft, of course. Then I don't really need to say much about the brass hardware. As you can see, the eyelets and speed hooks have held up solid. Now let's bring everything together with the stitch down construction. First, we'll go over the style and appearance, as well as quality, comparing to the Viberg and Jadd boot, because they're stitch down construction too. But also this Viberg Navy boot too, even though it's a 360-degree scalloped welt instead of a 270-degree double row stitch down construction. Also the Alden Indy, it's welted construction, but also goes around 270 degrees, so we can take a look at the heel area too. Aside from that issue with the exposed part at the top and front of the heel block I mentioned earlier, this portion is great and can come close to what you see on Alden and Viberg. The proportions are comparatively bulkier, but that doesn't seem out of place since it's not trying to be a super dressy boot, and will usually be worn in more casual and outdoorsy settings. Still, it does help the back look more refined. Alden and Viberg just take it a notch or two up, with more focus on slimness and refinement, without being too formal. Since I often wear these in dirtier conditions compared to Alden and Viberg, this area easily gathers dirt. I only directly cleaned the area once, closer to around the 1-year mark. A damp rag did most of the work. The hard brass brush helped a bit, but not that much. You would need a brush that has bristles which could get deeper into the area. I also used brass around this area to show how durable that leather really is, no scratching. After getting most of the dirt out, the clean boot on the left compared to the dirty one on the right, there was basically no damage from all that dirt and no noticeable drying. So don't feel like you have to take care of that part a lot, because it will get dirty again quite quickly. If you've seen my other reviews, you know I don't really care about minor inconsistency in stitching. I mean, you could always pick out something wrong just by zooming in and being picky. Even if there are more noticeable inconsistencies, they won't be that visible or visible at all at regular standing height. Parkhurst Stitchdown actually stands up quite well next to Viberg's famous quality. Obviously, it isn't as refined overall, and the stitching isn't as dense, but structurally and stylistically it does look good. The density and refinement of Viberg is more of a style thing, and the comparatively larger thread and lower density of stitching for Parkhurst doesn't really affect function and comfort, or water resistance performance. Also, since there's usually less material with stitchdown compared to welted construction, there can be some weight savings and flexibility gains, if I'm not mistaken. But it isn't that important since the thickness of all the sole layers is a bigger factor on how much the boots weigh and how flexible they are. But no matter how a boot is constructed, larger thread and lower density stitching do lean more casual. It can be seen with the Alden Indy, which is welted construction, and the Jadd Chukkas, which are single row 360-degree stitch down construction. The look of the stitching is mostly down to personal preference, your lifestyle, and how you wear the boots. It has little impact on durability and overall performance. The same with 270 versus 360 coverage, or stitch down versus Goodyear welt. Next, what I'll discuss can apply to stitch down, welted construction, and heritage boots in general, providing some nuance for this category of footwear. Because quite early on, within the first 4 months, I noticed some outsole separation with that boot that's meant for the right foot. This can happen more easily with any footwear in rougher conditions, with a great example being the damage shown on these Grantstone diesel boots in Loden suede. In this case, the separation can trace its roots back to a walk I took within the first 2 months. I was walking on some relatively clean trails on the outskirts of a town, where a local I knew suggested showing me some nearby fly dumping or fly tipping sites. Places where all kinds of trash is illegally dumped in the woods. I started exploring carefree a little too much, and likely hit this area just right a few times, mostly against a combination of scrap metal and lumber. This probably started the fractions of a millimeter worth of separation, not unlike what can happen to almost any kind of footwear, including heritage boots, like those Grantstones. I was so caught up in looking at all kinds of junk like furniture and broken car parts, so I wasn't really thinking about how I was walking in the boots, let alone whether I should record or not. Without me asking, it was highly suggested that I did not record anything, because we were close to an area where people were camping. They were described as being reclusive people that chose to live in the forest, but were otherwise functioning and working members of society, and generally didn't commit any crimes. Not like what you would usually think homeless people to be like. A lot of them had jobs, and after they finished work, they would go back to their place in the forest. Areas branching away from the main trails towards thicker brush, and obstacles like rocks, logs, and old junk, which seemed to be intentionally placed as some kind of barrier. Anyways, the local I was with knew some of these people, so I was allowed in some places, but not allowed in others. Since I wasn't familiar with the area and was taking in the sights, I stumbled a lot, helping to progress the damage by a few more fractions of a millimeter by impacting a combination of mostly sharp rocks and old roots, at just the right angle a few too many times. The point of the story is that those conditions aren't the norm for what most people would wear heritage boots through. Regular wear, and even some more rougher wear after that, didn't separate the sole a whole lot more. Separation with other boots does happen, but it's so small it's not visible, and you can only really tell if you run your fingernail along that area at the tip of the toe. Especially because most of my other heritage boots don't go through so much regular hard wear. Another thing is the stitching at the very top and front began to fade, first on that right boot that was damaged more, but then it also went to the left boot. This phenomenon, if you want to call it that, does happen but isn't that common. And my experience, along with other people's, can mostly come down to a combination of factors, like these less common situations the boots have been through, along with individual walking patterns and overall lifestyle, as well as just plain luck. This also serves as a demonstration of how the stitch-down construction helps keep the boot together, even when this kind of damage happens. Andrew explained this is because the outsole is internally lock-stitched. So the idea behind that is they are knotted through the layers for just such a case. Like I talked about at the start, no one has noticed the damage, and when I do tell people about it, only a few people have been able to point it out after a long, hard look. I've been kind of surprised that the older people I've talked to don't know about stitch-down or just resolable footwear in general, like people in their mid-70s or older. Maybe they might remember their parents having shoes or boots like that, but they usually don't have any experience with it. But they do often say that's a great feature, as they complain about their glued construction sneakers or whatever synthetic footwear they have that's delaminating where the rubber sole is peeling off. In order for the stitching to fade like they did on my boots, Andrew said there had to be direct abrasion to that area, which certainly did happen. It just doesn't come undone like that through natural stepping, and from places under or over surfaces during wear. More generally, he explained that people, including himself, don't notice when they might damage the front of their boots, especially around the midsole, welt, and toe box, just from doing things like contacting brake pedals and the curbside, as well as just general toe scraping and dragging, which again a lot of people do. Another common explanation he mentioned was that people often don't pick up their feet fully when they walk, and they often won't realize it. However, small damage can accumulate day after day, wearing down certain areas over time. Moreover, he stated that these things are anticipated by makers and any decent factory, and this is why they do things like use midsoles, high abrasion rubber compounds, double sewing, and lock stitching, so that the whole row won't unravel. But sometimes all these efforts we make still do not prepare the product for what a customer might do to the boots, or put the boots through. We're never going to be able to 100% prevent every single circumstance of wear which a customer may throw at the boots. That's just a reality. But we can be prepared as possible by using good materials and good building techniques to combat the majority. The thing is, there is always going to be an instance of wear which wasn't suitable for the build or materials. And those instances by data will be very small in volume of occurrences. So my case is very much a statistical/numerical minority occurrence, when compared to the boots out there which are performing fine, and don't have this very specific instance happening to them. Then he discussed something that somewhat annoys me and other boot enthusiasts who don't place too much emphasis on small details or have unrealistic expectations. Namely, that phenomenon when the vocal minority makes a small or rare issue seem like it's much more prevalent. So whenever I point out a flaw or share my experience with damage, it's just telling my own story and experience giving perspective. It can be common or uncommon. That's why I give context with details describing the conditions that led to my experience. The value I hope to bring to the audience is if you relate to my stories or how I wore the boots, then that will help inform how you will buy or wear boots. When it doesn't apply to you, or would be something that is uncommon to you, then you can just get better perspective that the damage is possible and there are imperfections. Especially when we're talking about the cosmetic side of things with things like cosmetic stitching inconsistencies, or even some instances of structural build quality, which may turn out to be not as common as you think, as opposed to just focusing on online discussions where the most vocal people are attracting the most attention. He also pointed out something I noticed about people posting in regards to how their boots have been damaged, either when they're new or after some wear. Not just Parkhurst, but boots in general. Yes, the overwhelming majority of the time when you find a post about damage or defects, it is likely real and did happen. But people might get the wrong idea from disproportional representation from these discussions, especially for brands that are much larger than Parkhurst and are more popular. Andrew put it quite well when he said, "We know the construction, so now we need to see what's actually happening to the boots while they're being worn in the real environment." That's why context is important. You need to get the full story. For example, people bought the wrong size, or they have certain habits that cause abrasion at certain areas, or have stories like mine that might not be as common, and won't be what most people do with heritage boots. At the end of the day, no matter the exact construction method, heritage boots are basically layers of leather and rubber sewn together, and the edges are exposed, so there's always the possibility for delamination and abrasion, no matter how tough the components or adhesion and binding is. That's why with modern footwear there's often rubber running up the front and center, and it's not uncommon for there to be a full rubber rand or bumper running around the bottom of boots, taking the place of exposed layers of leather and rubber held tightly together. Andrew expressed similar sentiments in this regard by saying, either that or you can get a single piece of outsole or a blown rubber sole and use that as the sole, because it's a single piece, so there shouldn't be any separation, because there's only one single layer, just abrasion from whatever wear is directly hitting the front. This discussion can be taken as a lesson that even though heritage boots are tough, and those legacy methods used in military and work boots in the past did hold up, nothing is indestructible. As the old saying goes, nothing lasts forever. Also, if you're going to be doing work or hiking for a long time, just get proper work and hiking boots, and not use lifestyle heritage boots like Parkhurst. I don't mean to use this as a disparaging comment to Parkhurst or other heritage boot brands that maintain this old style of construction, along with some emphasis on style and aesthetic design. It's just that a good example is Viberg. They traced their roots back to constructing rugged boots, ones that were actually used for real hard work in rough terrain and weather. But boots, like the ones I've shown, often fall into what's called the lifestyle category. They can be worn in rougher conditions, but a large portion of their purpose is to be stylish, and to be more long-lasting while providing better support for the feet. Which is why earlier I spoke about how it's more realistic that most people wear this kind of footwear, mostly in urban areas, and are able to wear them to do light work and go into nature. But it's not like they would do heavy manual labor in them regularly, or wear them for hikes all the time, especially if they're longer hikes on rougher terrain in unpleasant weather. Some people take the idea of wearing one thing to go anywhere and do everything too seriously and literally. Lifestyle heritage boots can be worn in many different ways and places in terms of style. They can provide traction and protection on lots of different kinds of terrain, as well as be long-lasting. But this mainly means wearing for style and to reduce fatigue, when mostly worn in urban areas, while still having the ability to walk into nature or rural areas, and to work in situations where heavy-duty safety features aren't a necessity. Just for some manual labor, like for when you need to move things for a longer distance or over uneven terrain, landscaping type stuff, or working on lighter machinery. Nothing too serious like multi-day hikes up a mountain, heavy industrial work, or the expectation they can last a decade without wearing down, in terms of needing a resole or showing damage and age on the uppers. Now I want to talk about something interesting that happened around the 10-month mark, which was when it was drier and warmer weather going from spring to summer. I noticed a squeak develop in that right boot. That didn't really make much sense to me because I thought this could only happen if the midsole or heel block degraded from moisture exposure for a long time. Maybe it happened earlier in the spring and winter, or even back in the fall. So basically I wore these at least 4 days a week, on average if you spread it out over the course of the year. Sometimes even every day for a full week. This might be a factor and could give credibility to the advice that you should let boots rest in between wears and not wear them for days in a row for extended periods of time, especially if they're exposed to moisture a lot. I always keep my boots in a well-ventilated area and do let them air dry if they get wet, and always use shoe trees. But there's still the possibility enough moisture accumulated for a long enough time to affect the binding between the layers of leather and rubber, opening up the possibility for leather on leather rubbing, or some loose leather rubbing on rubber, or some other non-leather component. For example, a popular theory is that a steel shank, which these boots have, is often not wrapped in fabric, and that could squeak against the leather, even if there's some minor shifting with the layers under feet. Andrew knows about this popular theory, and says it might not always be the case, and that there are lots of other variables, due to all the layers of rubber and leather, stitching, and adhesives. I noticed this can happen to boots and other footwear in general. Like, it's not uncommon that I notice other people's sneakers or running shoes squeaking, though this is the first heritage boot of mine that has a squeak. Coincidentally, what makes these different from my other heritage boots is that damage at the front and more persistent wear in rougher and wet conditions. Shortly, I will play this clip with sound, where the microphone is on the tongue with no laces, to show the sound isn't coming from the quarters and tongue rubbing, but rather from under the feet. You might have to turn the volume up, but when it gets to this point where I'm walking back in the other direction, turn it back down so that when it transitions to another clip, your speakers won't be blasting loud. Remember, the microphone was right on the boot. The squeaking is fainter when I'm standing up and wearing the boots normally. There was a point a few weeks ago, earlier in the summer, when I just stopped wearing the boots for about a week. When I put them back on, I didn't hear any squeaking until I walked about 100 meters, at which point it quickly came back to its original loudness. So what I'm gonna do is wait a while, maybe even more than 6 months, and just leave the boots alone. Then see if there's any difference letting the leather rest for a long time. Or whether things have been set and there's some variable at the bottom of the boot that won't go away, even after the leather has gotten way more rest. As Andrew and fellow heritage boot enthusiasts have pointed out, this isn't uncommon. Maybe you have a story of your own to share. Because even before I got into heritage boots, I sometimes noticed squeaking in other shoes I had before, like running shoes and dress shoes. So all kinds of footwear can get it, with all those variables under the feet with the components and how they're binded together. Plus how they're worn and the conditions they're exposed to, and just the luck of the draw. And actually, this may explain why some people think those famous overbuilt Pacific Northwest boots, with many more layers of leather, are not immune to this as well. And in fact, there could be a higher possibility for it to happen, because more layers and more binding means more variables, along with the fact they're worn in much more diverse and harsher conditions than average. Also, going back to the uppers, I will not oil the rest of them for at least some time more. I'll just let them age more and see how it goes. If the squeak doesn't go away after my long rest period, I will probably take these to a cobbler and see if taking them apart can reveal where this squeak is coming from. There might be a clear cause, or nothing could be found at all. I'll also be doing a longer-term update on my Parkhurst Niagara boots, which will also include more about Parkhurst and boot manufacturing. Then, if all that still wasn't enough, you can check out my boot review playlist linked in the description and pinned comment. There will be new boot reviews there eventually, so if you saw a boot in this video and it hasn't been reviewed on the playlist, it will eventually be reviewed.